Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Our lecture today is about the dural venous sinuses. The dural venous sinuses are spaces between the petrosal layer and meningeal layers of the dura mater. If you remember in the previous lecture, when we talk about the meninges of the brain, we said that the dura mater is composed of two layers, an outer layer which is called endothelial or petrosal layer, which is attached firmly to the inner surface of the skull bone, and an inner layer of dura mater which is called meningeal layer. These two layers are attached to each other firmly, but they are separated in certain places within the cranial cavity to form spaces, and these spaces, as we said, that is called the dural sinuses. And because it contains venous blood, so it is called dural venous sinuses. So they contain venous blood that originate from the brain or cranial cavity. All the cranial cavity all the structures within the cranial cavity, including the brain, cerebellum, and so on, all these structures, its blood will be drained by these dural venous sinuses, and ultimately later on these venous blood will end in the internal jugular vein, which pass through the jugular foramen, as we will discuss in the next time. So these dural venous sinuses contain venous blood that originate from the brain and or cranial cavity. The sinuses contain an endothelial lining. It's very important. It contains an endothelial lining, and that is continuous into the veins that are connected to them. These sinuses has no valves. It is different from the veins in other side of the bodies. All the veins in our bodies contains valves, but these dural venous sinuses carry no valves. Also, the veins that connect to these sinuses also contains no valve. The vast majority of the venous blood in the sinuses drains from the cranium into the internal jugular vein. All the veins from the intracranial tissue contents, all the venous drain will be drained into the internal jugular vein. We have 14 dural sinuses, and some of these dural sinuses are paired, that is to say, present on the right side of the cranial cavity and on the left side of the cranial cavity. And other dural venous sinuses are unpaired, let's say single. So what are these, the unpaired and paired sinuses? The unpaired sinuses, we have the superior sagittal sinus, we have the inferior sagittal sinus, we have the straight sinus, the occipital sinus, the anterior intercavernous sinus, the posterior intercavernous sinus, and the basilar venous plexus or sinus. The paired dural venous sinuses include the transverse sinus, the sigmoid sinus, the cavernous sinus, the superior petrosal sinus, the inferior petrosal sinus, and the sphenoparietal sinus, and the petrosal sinus. Now we discuss these sinuses, and we'll give you where is its location, where they are situated, and to which it connects. Starting with the superior sagittal sinus, this sinus is located in the upper border of the falx cerebri. You know, the falx cerebri, as we said in the previous lectures, is one of the membranous extension of the dura mater that separate the right and left cerebral hemisphere. So this superior sagittal sinus extends in the upper border of the falx cerebri and begins at the crista galli. You know crista galli? Crista galli is a small bony projection in the anterior cranial fossa near the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. وذكرنا بأنه معناها هو الكريستا كالي هو عرف الديك. From this crista galli, the superior sagittal sinus start, and the superior sagittal sinus is fed by blood from the superior cerebral veins. All the superior cerebral veins drains into the superior sagittal sinus, and this sagittal sinus ends at the confluence of sinuses near the internal occipital protuberance. Actually, many sinuses will direct it backwards, surrounding and beneath and in between the hemispheres of the brain. Their blood or they pass posteriorly to an area which is near the internal occipital protuberance. You know, we have an external occipital protuberance when we study the skull bone, and we said that we have an external occipital protuberance. This is from outside of the occipital bone. From inside, just opposite to the external, we have an internal occipital protuberance. Here in this area, we have the area or part of the sinus which is called confluence of sinuses. محل التقاء السينوسز. التقاء عدة superior sagittal sinus and transverse sinuses, occipital sinuses. This area of union of the sinuses is called the area of confluence of sinuses, and it is situated near the internal occipital. I will show you in the next picture these sinuses and its situation. The second sinus, single sinus, is the inferior sagittal sinus, and this inferior sagittal sinus, it is located in the lower free border of the falx cerebri. You see this picture show you this areas. This is the right hemisphere of the brain, and of course here the left is removed to show you this falx cerebri, which is a membranous extension of the dura mater between the right and the left hemisphere, extended here. This is dura mater, of course. It's called falx cerebri. In the upper border, we have the superior sagittal sinus. In the lower border, we have the inferior sagittal sinus. You see? And of course, here we have another membranous extension, which is called tentorium cerebelli, and as you know, as we said in the previous lecture, this cover the posterior cranial fossa, and beneath this tentorium, it's like khayma, beneath it is we have the cerebellum. Of course, this is an important because we will talk about other sinuses. We will reach these areas and you should know it. So this is the falx cerebri between the two hemispheres, and this is the tentorium cerebelli. And of course, in the upper border of the falx cerebri, we have superior sagittal sinus, and in the lower border, we have the inferior sagittal sinus. And of course, here in this area, you see, is called the confluence of the sinuses. And this arrows will show you the direction of the blood within these sinuses. The direction of blood will come like this. Although there is no valves, but the blood depends on the pressure and so on. The blood will come posteriorly, like as you show in this arrows. You see here and here and here, all of the and here, and then it will cause to other sinuses, as we will discuss later on, and they ends in the to form the vein which is called the jugular vein, the internal jugular vein, and which leaves the cranium through the jugular foramen. You know the jugular foramen through this, the end of this sinus, of course, one on the right, one on the left. This is also the jugular foramen the right jugular foramen, this is the left jugular foramen. It leaves these sinuses after it drains the blood from the brain and other intracranial structures. It leaves through this jugular foramen to form a single vein, which is called the internal jugular vein. And of course, this internal jugular vein we have here within the carotid sheath. Don't forget, this will pass to the carotid sheath, and then it would reach until at its end it reach the heart, the right side of the heart. Okay, and also as we said that the superior sagittal sinus will drain all the superficial veins of the cerebrum. Superficial cerebral veins, all these veins will drain into this sinus, superior sagittal sinus. Of course, the inferior sagittal sinus also drains multiple veins from the cerebrum into this sinus. Yes. Now, what about the inferior sagittal sinus? As we said, it's located in the lower free border of the falx cerebri between the two cerebral hemispheres. It begins anteriorly here, and ends with its junction with the straight sinus. It ends in the junction with the straight sinus. The straight sinus, this is straight sinus. This is the straight sinus. As we said, this is the tentorium cerebelli, and this is the falx cerebelli, and here between this and this we have the straight sinus, and this inferior sagittal sinus, it ends by joining the straight sinus, which is also a single sinus. Yes. Now the straight sinus, it originates with the union of the great cerebral vein and inferior sagittal sinus. How it is formed? It is formed by union of two structures, which is the great cerebral vein. Here we have a great cerebral vein, also drains the hemisphere of the brain. When this great cerebral vein unite with the inferior sagittal sinus, they form the straight sinus. You see, they form the straight sinus. So the straight sinus is formed. Straight sinus is formed by union of the great cerebral vein with the inferior sagittal sinus. You see? Okay. It runs posteriorly in the junction between the falx cerebelli. Of course, falx cerebelli also one of the extension of the dura between the two cerebellum, sorry, and the tentorium cerebelli. Or you can say that it passes posteriorly between the junction of the falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli here, as is shown in this picture. And also, of course, you see the flow of blood goes posteriorly to the confluence of the sinuses. To become, of course, when it goes posteriorly to reach the area of confluence here, it joins, or it forms the direction of blood will pass here, and this sinus, which is called a transverse sinus. Here is called transverse sinus, and of course, usually to the left side. Usually to the left side. As we see, straight is a single sinus. So when it reaches the area of confluence, it takes its way to form a transverse sinus. And of course, the superior sagittal sinus, when it reaches the area of confluence, its main blood, or the blood drains to the right side to form right transverse sinus. So the straight sinus will go to the transverse sinus, and the superior sagittal sinus will go to the right transverse sinus. You see, it is important here to know. Although this picture will not show you this is what I said exactly, but you should put in your mind that The straight sinus, usually it goes to the left side to form the left transverse sinus, while the superior sagittal sinus, usually its blood would goes to the right side, and it will form the right transverse sinus. Okay. Yes. Now we talk about the cavernous sinus. The cavernous sinus, why it is called cavernous sinus? Actually, in the cross section of this sinus, of course, its length is about 2.5 centimeter length, centimeter. If we take a cross section through this sinus, we will see that this sinus is composed of multiple small spaces, just like caves. So because it is multilocular sinus, it is called cavernous sinus. The cavernous sinus are present on either side of the sphenoid bone, on the body of the sphenoid bone. You know the body, the sphenoid bone has a body, and at the top of the body we have the sella turcica, in which the pituitary gland sit. So on each side of the body of the sphenoid bone, we have this cavernous sinus, which is of course in the middle cranial fossa. This cavernous sinus receives blood. It receives the blood from the sphenoparietal sinuses. Sphenoparietal sinuses, which are located, these sphenoparietal sinuses located underneath the free edges of the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. Do you remember the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone? Under its free edge, beneath the free edge of the lesser wings, we have a sinuses which is called sphenoparietal sinuses, because it is between the sphenoid bone, the lesser wing of sphenoid, and the parietal bone, so it is called sphenoparietal sinuses. So the sinuses, of course, these sphenoparietal sinuses also, some of the cerebral veins come to it from the bones, from the nearby structures. The venous blood come to these sphenoparietal sinuses, and then from these sphenoparietal sinuses, the blood will be drained to the cavernous sinus. The blood also drains into the cavernous sinus via the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins. So we have two sources of blood that come to the cavernous sinus. We have the sphenoparietal blood from the sphenoparietal sinuses and the blood from the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins. This blood will come to the cavernous sinus. We have small sinuses, which is single, and it is called the intercavernous sinuses. And these intercavernous sinuses are two. One is anterior and the other is posterior. Why it is called intercavernous sinus? Because this sinuses will connect the blood from the right cavernous sinus to the left cavernous sinus, and because it is situated anterior to the sella turcica, and the other one is posterior to the sella turcica, connecting the right and left cavernous sinuses, so it is called anterior and posterior intercavernous sinuses. So the blood from the right and left cavernous sinuses also can be mixed because of this intercavernous sinuses. They are located, these anterior and posterior, located in the diaphragma cella. You know, diaphragma cella, this is the fourth membranous extension of the dura. You know, we have the falx cerebelli, tentorium, and lastly we have the diaphragma cella. All these four membranous extension of the are membranous extension of the dura mater. So the intercavernous sinuses are located in the diaphragma cella, which covers the hypophyseal fossa, which covers the hypophyseal fossa, cella torsica, and surrounds the hypophyseal stalk, surrounds the stalk of the pituitary gland. You know, the pituitary gland has a stalk connecting the pituitary gland, which sit in the cella torsica, and through its stalk it would attach to the hypothalamus. So these anterior, the intercavernous sinuses, the anterior and posterior, which surrounds the hypophyseal stalk. So you know its location? Okay. The cavernous sinuses, as we said, are situated on either side of the body of the sphenoid bone. Because of its location in the midicranial fossa, because of its location here, and we have many structures that leave the cranium or leave the brain tissue, like nerves or other structures that enter the cranium, like arteries, in close relation with the cavernous sinus. So some of these structures will pass through the cavernous sinus, and others will not penetrate the cavernous sinus, but it passes within its lateral wall, within the lateral wall of the sinus. So we divide these structures into two groups. Divide the first group is structures that pass through the cavernous sinus. It, it enters the cavernous sinus and it leaves the cavernous sinus. These structures are, first of all, we have the internal carotid artery. And as you know, as we said in the previous lecture, the internal carotid artery enters the midicranial fossa. It passes in the carotid canal, and then it enters the midicranial fossa to the foramen lacerum. And once it enters the midicranial fossa, it enters the cavernous sinus. It passes through the cavernous sinus, and then it leaves the cavernous sinus to give its branch. The second thing that passes through the cavernous sinus is the sympathetic nerve plexus. And as we know, the sympathetic nerve supply usually it forms like a plexus around the major arteries and its branch to reach its target organ. So the internal carotid artery, in its outer surface, there is a plexus of sympathetic nerves, and because the artery passes through the cavernous sinus, so this plexus also will be within the artery, also will pass through the cavernous sinus. The third thing, or the third structure, is the abducens nerves, cranial nerve number 6, which supply the lateral rectus muscle of the eye, also pass within or through the cavernous sinus, and then of course it leaves the cavernous sinus to enter the orbital cavity through the superior orbital fissure. The other structures, the other group of structures that pass in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Actually, I will show you a picture at the end of the lecture of these structures and how some of them it passes through the cavernous sinus and the other how it passes through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. The structures that pass in the lateral wall are three nerves. Three nerves. The third cranial nerve, the fourth cranial nerve, and two divisions of the fifth cranial nerve. So 3, 4, 5 cranial nerves. First of all, we have the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. Also, it passes through the wall, lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, and then it leaves the cavernous sinus to enter the orbital cavity through the superior orbital fissure. And the second structure is the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4. Also, it leaves the cavernous sinus to enter through the superior orbital fissure to the orbital cavity. And lastly, we have the ophthalmic nerve, which is the first division of the trigeminal nerve, and the maxillary nerve, which is the second division of trigeminal nerve. Of course, after it leaves the maxillary, the ophthalmic nerve, once it leaves the cavernous sinus, it will pass through the superior orbital fissure to supply the intraorbital structures. And we have the maxillary nerve, after it leaves the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, it will leave the cranium, the cranial cavity, through foramen rotundum to pass in the infratemporal fossa. The cavernous sinuses drain posteriorly through the superior and inferior petrosal sinuses, and inferiorly through the pterygoid plexus of veins. So direction of blood from the cavernous sinus, either actually it is in two directions. It drains posteriorly and inferiorly. Posteriorly through the superior and inferior petrosal sinuses, and I will discuss these sinuses after a few minutes, and inferiorly through the pterygoid plexus of veins. And if you remember when we in the previous lectures, where the pterygoid plexus of veins, which is one of the contents of intratemporal fossa. You see, this actually this cavernous sinus has free communication from the outside the cranial cavity, that any infection which may present in the tissues that drained by the veins that connect to the cavernous sinus may cause the infection to reach the cavernous sinus, and which is actually very serious condition if the infection reach to the cavernous sinus, which may lead to a condition which is called cavernous sinus thrombosis. That is, say, from the infection that reach the cavernous sinus, the blood will become thrombosed, and this has many serious sequelae if not treated early, and the infection should be controlled early. So this picture will show you the cavernous sinus and what structures pass through, and what structures pass through it, and the other structures pass through the wall, lateral wall face. Actually, this is the body of this is the left side or left sphenoid bone, and this is sphenoid air sinus. Don't feel confused with these terms. When the sphenoid sinus, it is air sinus. I say one of the paranasal sinuses. Sphenoid sinuses is an air space within this body of the sphenoid bone, if you remember. And of course, this is the right and this is the left. Here we have on both sides of the body of the sphenoid, this is the body of sphenoid, and of course this is the sella turcica, and here we have the pituitary gland. Okay, and on each side of the body, one here and other here, we have this cavernous sinus, and you see the structures, the cross section of the cavernous sinus. It has many spaces, just like caves, so it is called cavernous sinus. The structures that pass through the cavernous sinus, we have through the cavernous sinus, here we have the abducens nerve. You see, this is the abducens nerve, and the sixth cranial nerve, and the internal carotid artery. Actually, this is the internal carotid artery, and on the wall of the extent of the internal carotid artery, we have this sympathetic nerve plexus surrounding the artery. So these three structures, the abducens nerve, the internal carotid nerve, and the sympathetic plexus, nerve plexus surrounding the wall of the internal carotid artery, these pass through the sinus and leave the sinus entirely. And of course, this is the lateral wall. This is the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. And through the lateral wall, we have, first of all, we have the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3, and we have the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4, and we have the V1 cranial nerve number 5, or 5, the first division of trigeminal nerve, and we have the maxillary nerve, which is second division of trigeminal nerve. Okay, so these are three structures here, and these structures pass, four structures pass through the lateral wall, and three structures pass through the cavernous sinus. Okay, now the superior petrosal sinus, actually from its name, petrosal related to which bone? To petrous bone. Okay? You remember the petrous bone in the skull, in the middle cranial fossa, we have it has superior border, has this petrous bone has superior border and inferior border. So the sinus that pass along the superior border of the petrous bone is called superior petrosal sinus. These sinuses are located in the edge of the tentorium cerebelli. In the edge of tentorium cerebelli on the ridge. ridge يعني مثل تلة أو حافة أو سلسلة من المرتفعات. تتذكرون البتروس بون، شكل البتروس بون، الإيدج مالته الفري إيدج تكون irregular just like ridge سلسلة من المرتفعات الصغيرة. So here of course the tentorium cerebelli attached to this area of the petrous bone. So within this area the two layers of dura mater open to form a space, and along the petrous bone, along the upper part of the petrous bone, to form the superior petrosal sinus. Okay, they drain into the transverse sinus. Of course, the superior petrosal sinus, it will drain into the transverse sinus. The inferior petrosal sinuses, these sinuses are found at the base of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Remember, the petrous bone in its location within the base of the skull, from inside, of course. Along its base, we have another sinus in relation to the petrous bone. It is called inferior petrosal sinus. The inferior petrosal sinus, because it is inferior in the base of the skull, it drains its blood directly into the internal jugular vein. Into the internal jugular vein, which is very near to the jugular foramen, where the formation of the internal jugular vein starts. So the inferior petrosal sinus drains into the internal jugular vein, while the superior drains into the transverse sinuses. Of course, later on, this transverse sinuses also will form another sinus, and then it drains into the internal jugular vein, as we will see later on. The other sinus is called the basilar sinus or basilar plexus. You know the occipital bone and the body slope from the, if you look to the skull from inside, to look the foramen magnum, in the front of the foramen magnum there is the basilar bone of the occipital bone. So along the basilar bone we have also a plexus of venous channels on this bone, and this is called the basilar sinus or basilar plexus. It consists of 7 interlacing venous channels تلاسنج متداخلة مع بعض between the layers of the dura mater. احنا ذكرنا الديورا ماتر انه هي تبطن لنا السكال كلها، فعندما تبطن السكال lining of the skull from within, where is irregular, there is structures like petrous bone, like lesser wing, like body of sphenoid. All these area will be covered by the dura mater, and in certain places قلنا dura mater, it's 2-layer matter, the dura mater separate to form these sinuses. So these sinuses here, like in basilar, near the basilar part of the occipital bone, also the meningeal and perosteal layers of the dura mater separated to form several interlacing venous channels between the layers of the dura mater over the basilar part of the occipital bone, and serves to connect the two inferior petrosal sinuses. Also, it communicates with the internal vertebral venous plexus. Of course, this basilar venous plexus, because it's close to the foramen magnum, so there is some connection and communication, as we said, with inferior petrosal sinuses and then to the jugular vein. And also it communicates with another venous plexuses, which is called internal vertebral venous plexuses. This internal vertebral venous plexuses within the vertebral canal. There is a venous plexuses. Also, this basilar sinus have a connection with these venous plexuses, vertebral venous plexuses. Now we talk about the transverse sinuses. These sinuses extend laterally from the confluence of the sinuses in the tentorium cerebelli, as I showed you in the previous photo, previous picture. So the transverse sinuses travel ventrally to become the sigmoid sinuses. So it passes laterally, one on the right, one on the left, and then it will form another sinus, bigger sinus, which is called a sigmoid sinuses on each side. The sigmoid sinuses bend تنحني into an S-shaped curve, just like the letter of S. It's called S-shaped curve, and continue into the internal jugular vein to the jugular foramen. This is the end of the sinuses. It ends with it takes the blood, all the blood from the cerebrum, all the blood from the meninges, all the blood from intracranial cavity, lastly will be collected into the sigmoid sinuses, and then it leaves the cranium through the jugular foramen as internal jugular vein. We have also another sinus which is called occipital sinus. Also from its name, it is related to the occipital bone, and this is a single, not paired. It is in the center, the back of the occipital bone. This sinus is located in the posterior attached border of the falx cerebelli. Falx cerebelli is a membranous extension of the dura that separates the right and left cerebrum, and this attached to the posterior or the inner aspect of the occipital bone, falx cerebri. At its attachment to the bone, to the occipital bone, it will separate the dura here. It will separate the inner and outer layer of the dura at the posterior edge of the falx cerebelli, separate to form this occipital sinus. It communicates superiorly with the confluence of sinuses. You see, this is how many sinus come to this confluence of sinuses: the superior sagittal sinus, the transverse sinuses, the straight sinus, and here we have the occipital sinus. All these sinuses unite to form in this area, which is called confluence of sinuses, محل اجتماع أو التقاء sinuses, and inferiorly with the internal vertebral plexus. You see, يعني the internal vertebral plexus, it has two communications from the basilar sinuses of basilar plexus and also from the occipital sinus. Here, this picture will show you the site of these sinuses. We will discuss it. Of course, this is the superior sagittal sinus. You see in the center, superior sagittal sinus. And here we have the sphenoparietal sinus beneath the lesser wing. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. So sphenoparietal sinus. And here we have the cavernous sinus on each side of the body of the sphenoid bone. This is the right, this is the left cavernous sinus. And here we have the anterior, and we have the cavernous sinus that connect the right and left intercavernous sinus. And here, of course, the basilar plexus. This is the basilar bone of the basilar of the occipital bone, and we have here we have the basilar plexus of the sinuses, or some basal plexus. And of course, here we have the superior petrosal sinus. Superior petrosal sinus here along the this edge of the petrous bone. This is the petrous bone, and of course we have this is the inferior petrosal sinus. This is the inferior petrosal sinus. Superior petrosal sinus, inferior petrosal sinus, and of course here we have the occipital sinus. This is the foramen magnum. This is the occipital sinus, and it attached to the confluence of sinus. This is confluence of sinuses, and here we have the occipital inferiorly to the internal vertebral plexus. Also has attachment. Also, this is also has inferiorly extension to or communication with the internal vertebral plexus of venous plexus. And of course, this is the transverse. This is the left transverse sinus, and this is the right transverse sinus. And here it bent like S shape. You see, this is S shape sinus, is called sigmoid. And then this sigmoid sinus will leave the cranium through the foramen magnum, and this will form the internal jugular vein, of course, on both sides. This is the internal jugular foramen, here the internal jugular foramen, and it ends as internal jugular, the jugular foramen, and this sigmoid sinus passes through it to form the internal jugular vein. Well, this picture also will show you all the sinuses, superior sinus, inferior sinus, and you see these veins, cerebral veins, superficial veins. All these veins will drain into these sinuses, and the direction of blood will pass in this direction posteriorly. All these sinus drains. This is the falx cerebri. This is falx cerebri between the hemisphere. And also this will have the straight sinus. وقلنا straight sinus from the great vein, cerebral veins, from the union of great cerebral vein and the inferior sinus, it formed the straight sinus. And here we have the cavernous sinus. And as we said, the cavernous sinus, it drains also from a ophthalmic vein, and also you see even the anterior facial vein have a free communication with the cavernous sinus through this area. This veins has no valves, and the blood can pass from here to here. And so if there is any infection here, in case of infection in this soft tissue or in the eye, the orbit, all this infection may reach this cavernous sinus and may cause a condition which is known as cavernous sinus thrombosis. Cavernous sinus thrombosis, and this is very dangerous actually illness. Sometimes it's very not treated early, may lead to many complications. And of course, this is the area of confluence of the sinuses, and this is the occipital sinus. You see, this is the occipital sinus, and here, of course, the internal occipital protuberance, and also here the transverse sinus. This will cause the transverse sinus will ends with sigmoid sinus, and the sigmoid sinus will pass to the jugular foramen to form, lastly, leave the cranium as internal jugular vein. Okay, thank you very much for your listening.